thank you for joining us today to our actual first VheP seminar of the year. We're very lucky to have Dr. Robson, who's been an old acquaintance of mine and a co-author among many things, and currently working as a commissioner and deputy chair at the Productivity Commission. He will talk to us about productivity and the costs of living, Australia's two economic challenges. Of course, we will record this session for the benefit of those that cannot attend today's seminar and webinar. So just briefly, Alex has a long-standing experience and multifaceted career, both in academia and the public sector, but also private sector. Recently worked at UI. Before that, he was the Australian ambassador at the OECD, if I'm not mistaken. And also he has been a very accomplished academic working in various institutions as an economist in Australia. So welcome, Alex. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Francesco. Yeah, so today I thought I'd talk a bit about a topic that's touches every Australian, but also it's been in the news quite a lot, and it's around the cost of living and some thinking that has been going on at the Commission about the relationship between the cost of living and our productivity performance. So what I'm going to talk about today is a bit of a primer on productivity and how we measure it at the Commission, why it matters, and I'll talk about the link between productivity and cost of living and real wages. I'll discuss our productivity performance over decades, over the last financial year, and then also there was data just out yesterday, give a bit of an update on that, and in particular, what happened to productivity during and after COVID. There's a bit of an interesting story there. Then I'll discuss the nature of the long-term challenge around productivity in Australia, and then give a bit of a flavour of what we advanced in our report last year to the government on our five-year productivity review. And I'll talk a little bit about non-market services, which are relevant for obviously health economics, but also aged care, disability care, and so on. So in my remarks today, it's not new. These things I've said before. In particular, if you would like to read it in more detail, I gave an opening statement to the Senate Committee on Cost of Living last year, and you can go and look at that on the Productivity Commission website. Okay, so some of you, So yeah, I'm going to give a bit of a primer on productivity, why it matters, the link with productivity and the cost of living and real wages, our recent productivity performance, both over the last financial year and more recently, and then also we'll take a longer term perspective. I'll talk about the characteristics or the nature of the productivity challenge in Australia, and then talk a little bit about what we did last year in our Advancing Prosperity report. Okay, so when we talk about productivity, we're talking about labour productivity. So we take output, so GDP, value of final goods and services, and divide it by the number of hours worked. There's an interesting story in Australia last financial year about the number of hours worked, and I'll come back to that. But you can see immediately from that sort of calculation, output divided by hours worked. If hours worked go up, then and nothing else happens, then measured productivity is going to go down. So it's not, when we talk about productivity, it's often a misperception out there in the public that we're talking about people working harder or longer. It's not that at all. In fact, it's about working smarter. So taking people's skills and knowledge, improving them, machinery, equipment and capital that people are working with, making that better. The ideas that are out there, innovation and inventions, applying those in a better way so that every hour that people work produces more output. Mechanically, when you think about aggregate productivity, we can think about it coming from two different sources. One is, as I just mentioned, we can use and employ more capital per person. So that's more machinery, more buildings, more equipment, all of those sorts of things that for a worker of given skills, it enables them to produce more in an hour of work. And there's this other thing called multi-factor productivity, or MFP, which is a measure of output per mix of units. And that tends to rise with changes in innovation, knowledge, skills, these other things that we can't directly capture if we were just to build a new building or install a new piece of machinery. And so it's a lot of research in macroeconomics is around what drives multi-factor productivity. How do you get these new ideas? How do we apply them? How do we improve skills in the economy? How do we improve the openness of the economy, reduce inappropriate regulations? There's all these factors that economists think feed into this multi-factor productivity thing, and it's often referred to as a measure of our ignorance. We think there's things that affect it, but it's often hard to work out the link between policy changes and this multi-factor productivity. And I'll give some practical examples as we go through, as well as what it means for productivity to improve over the longer term. Okay, so here's the longer term story in Australia. So the growth in labour productivity in the decade 2010 to 2020, it was 1.1% per year. And that is the slowest rate of growth in productivity over the last 6 decades. I should note here that this is not a phenomenon that's unique to Australia. It's happening in many advanced economies around the world, and we can speculate as to why that might be the case. But that's just to set this challenge in in a longer term perspective. So we're not talking necessarily about the last year or even the last 5 years. There's been this productivity slowdown in Australia and elsewhere, and I'll talk some possible reasons for that. So why does it matter? Like, we could calculate these things, but why ultimately does it matter? Well, in the long run, productivity growth is the main factor in driving improvements in living standards. So that can come about in 3 broad ways. One is that goods and services can become cheaper, and I'll talk about that. We can get better quality of goods and services, and that's particularly applies to things like health, education, these non-market services where often it's not a reduction in costs that people actually want, it's an improvement in quality matched to their preferences that they're after. And also productivity growth leads to a wider variety of goods and services. Okay, so here's an example, practical example of the productivity dividend. So what we did in Advancing Prosperity, which is the 5-year review that we published last year, was to take a look at some basic goods and services that households consume and worked out the hours of work of an average worker that needed to afford those goods and services. So for example, the first one there, a double bed, mattress, blanket and pillows. In 1901, it took the average worker 185 hours of work to be able to afford that. Okay. Whereas in 2019, it took 18 hours of work. So if we think about that, that's a dividend of productivity growth. All it's saying is that the value of people's work over time in terms of things that they want that they can actually now afford, that's, that example is a 10-fold increase in productivity over that period. And there's other examples there. To buy a bicycle, in 1901, it was 473 working hours on average. Today, it's 6 hours. So that's a massive increase in the average productivity of a person. So this drives home the point that productivity growth is not about working harder or longer. The person in 1901 wasn't, being lazy or not working a lot of hours and not working very hard. They were, okay? And it didn't suddenly happen that we went from 473 working hours to 6 hours to buy a bicycle because people were working so much harder and so much longer. It came about because of changes in the way that people worked, increases in innovation, increases in knowledge, openness of the economy. If we're talking about a bicycle that's imported from abroad, all of these things led to that kind of improvement. Now you can see here from other things, however, that sometimes over time there isn't such a big improvement in productivity. So things like rent, 20 hours of work in 1901, 11 hours in 2000 and only 9 hours in 2019. So the productivity improvement there hasn't been as rapid. It's still an improvement, but not as much. So this is some practical examples of what we mean by productivity driving living standards. And ultimately it comes down to how many hours of work does the average person have to put in order to enjoy all of these kinds of things that they want, whether it's bicycles, healthcare, education, beds, theatre, loaves of bread, and so on. So if we think about the loaf of bread example, the productivity improvement there would have come about from better land management practices, better manufacturing processes, better ways of dealing with crops and pests and so on, better machinery on a farm, all of these sorts of things, better knowledge about how to manage the land and how to grow grains and so on. So a lot of things go into a productivity improvement in these examples. So not only is it positively correlated and actually the main cause of increases in living standards, it's also the case that it's not necessarily negatively correlated with other things. So people care about more than just output of goods and services. They care about inequality. They care about environmental quality and other things. So here's an example where if we look at changes in, say, extreme poverty around the world or in Australia, then that's gone down as well. If we think about the number of people in extreme poverty. So the point here is that productivity growth, yes, it's associated with improvements in living standards, it sometimes can be associated too with other undesirable things, but it tends to be positively correlated with a lot of other things we care about as well. So the point here is, although it's a narrow measure of living standards, it may often be enough to think about broader notions of living standards as well. But there's big debate, obviously, about that. So we think about the cost of living, and you think about the conversations that go on around the dinner table in households around Australia. What is it that people really mean by the cost of living? Obviously, it's their purchasing power, what they can afford to buy. And that depends on, obviously, the costs of the goods and services, but it's all relative to the wages that they're getting and the incomes that they're getting. And so it comes back again to, what can I afford to buy with the number of hours that I can work? And this shows up in links between labour productivity and real wages. So the left-hand panel there is patterns of that over time. And the right-hand panel there is looking at those growth rates over time and comparing them. So broadly, if we look at the two dotted lines, I'll explain what they are. Over long periods, wages and productivity tend to move together. So it's going back to that story around the bicycle, the loaf of bread, the bed. If productivity is improving, then I can afford to buy with my wage more goods and services. Now, there is a gap there. Okay? So if we take the two solid lines, the dark blue line and the light blue line, that's for the whole economy. And although they're moving both together, there is this gap opening up. And that's known as decoupling. So there's a big debate out there about the decoupling between productivity and wages. But if we exclude agriculture and mining, and we put out some research on this last year, we take those two sectors out, then the link between productivity and real wages becomes very close. And in fact, in the majority of sectors in Australia, the link between productivity and wages is extremely close. But we're not saying that at the aggregate it always looks that way. There are reasons why it may not hold in particular sectors, but on average, that link is pretty close. So it's important here because then we think about, well, what are policies to increase real wages? Well, if they're moving with productivity, then productivity is the main game. There might be other things you can do to affect real wages, but if there's this close link over time, then ultimately, if you want to have sustained increases in real wages, you're going to have to do something about productivity improvements. And in turn, as I said before, really the real wages story is the cost of living story. People are struggling with their budgets. Budgets are a lot easier to manage if you have a higher wage and higher income, and it all comes back to what can I afford to buy given my hours of work, and that's a real wage story. So that's why I entitled this talk The Twin Challenge, because it really is talking largely about the same thing. Productivity improvement in the long run is like an increase in real wages, and that is an improvement in the cost of living, broadly speaking. Okay, so what happened in the last financial year? So we put out a bulletin last week, about what happened in 22-23. And I want to draw your attention to that red number there in that first column. Labour productivity in Australia declined by 3.7% last year. So that's a record decline. So there's a few things to say about that. If you notice the number above that, hours worked in Australia increased in the 2022-23 financial year by nearly 7%. So we've had low unemployment, which is a good thing. People are getting more hours of work. Real wages, though, declined and productivity declined. So what happened in Australia last year was that people were trying to sustain their incomes and increase their incomes, not by securing a real wage, but by working longer hours. And mechanically, if output's still going up by 3% there, but hours worked went up by close to 7%, that's mechanically going to show up as a reduction in labour productivity. So why did it happen? We'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of slides, but it is that financial year and during COVID is a historical event for Australian productivity. And what happened during COVID was actually the opposite, that we had restrictions on whether people could go to work or not. So hours worked declined during COVID, output didn't decline by as much. And so actually we had a big upswing in productivity, paradoxically, during COVID. It's just a measurement thing. So we wouldn't want to shut down the economy in that way again, simply to secure an increase in productivity. It was a byproduct of other things that were going on. But that's now in 22-23, it's just completely reversed itself. So people are going back to work, output's still increasing, restrictions are easing off, but measured productivity has declined. So what we've had in Australia during COVID and afterwards is what we call a productivity bubble. It went up, restrictions came off, it's gone down, and it's basically now at the same level as it was before COVID. So the question now for policy is, well, how do we secure now a sustained increase in productivity, given that's what's happened? So this slide just talks about all of those numbers. Hours worked rose by 6.9%, productivity fell, real wages fell, but interestingly, per capita incomes rose, and that was because of, even though real wages were falling, people were just increasing their hours. So the two things mechanically that we can point to that further explain that, or shed some light on it, are what's happened to the amount of capital relative to labour in the economy. So the number of machines and equipment and buildings and so on that people actually have to work with. And last financial year, that fell by nearly 5%. The reason for that is that although the economy is coming out of these restrictions, people are working more hours, it's easier to employ someone or increase their hours at very short notice. It's much more difficult to say, I'm going to build a new factory or a new building or install some piece of capital. It's very uncertain when you invest. It takes a long time to install. It's a big decision. And so that tends to be a lagging effect when things are happening very rapidly. And so mechanically, we saw that as a big fall in the capital labour ratio. And that's one of the biggest on record for Australia. And the other thing that happened was this fall in multi-factor productivity. Again, that's a significantly large fall in the history of what's happened in Australia. We think that that's due to a labour measurement effect. So new workers are coming in very rapidly. They may not have the same average productivity as people who are already working, particularly if they're young or inexperienced workers or new workers. Not the case for everybody, but on average, we think that's what's happened here. And so multi-factor productivity measured fell by 0.5%. An alternative explanation, if we think about multi-factor productivity as reflecting knowledge or innovation, I don't think that everyone forgot what they knew after COVID or got more stupid or anything like that. It's just, I think we obviously have all the innovations and everything else we had before. We think it's mainly due to this labour measurement effect. So here's what's happened in multi-factor productivity in Australia over the longer term, and you can see, and we decompose productivity here into those two factors, and out there on the end is 2022-23, a big reduction in capital deepening and a big reduction in multi-factor productivity as well. Income growth is due to productivity, changes in hours worked, the terms of trade, so what we can get for our exports relative to what we pay for our imports, also affects our national income. The amount of income we get from investments in net terms from abroad and so on, and that all adds up to this gross national income per capita. And you can see here at the end there, it did increase slightly in Australia, but there's two big offsetting things there. Labour utilisation increased, but labour productivity decreased. That's the green and the light blue bars there. But again, you could see the historical nature of what's happened in the last couple of years, and in particular the last year. By industry, we can break it down as well in the data, what's happened over the in 2022-23. And the interesting story here is the sectoral breakdown just of labour productivity on the right-hand side. So you can see that more and more people started to enter the sector of accommodation and food services, also wholesale trade. Those sectors tend to be relatively less productive on average per worker than other sectors. It's just in terms of a measurement effect. So the more workers you get into those sectors, all else being equal, it's going to drag down your measured productivity. The opposite happened during COVID, so people couldn't go out for meals, less of these activities going on, so they withdraw their labour, output still relatively constant overall in the economy, and so productivity went up during COVID. But there is a bit of a story here to tell more about that sectoral breakdown. We haven't had too much to say about that, but it is just interesting to note that that's been happening. As to why it's been happening, I think that requires a bit more further work. All right, so this is all looking back to June last year, but we're now in March 24, and so we've had 2 more quarters of data that's come out, and we had some yesterday. So in yesterday's data, which is to the end of calendar year 2023, the economy grew by 0.2% in that quarter to be 1.5% higher through the year. And we've had improvements in labour productivity in that quarter and the quarter before. So this is telling the story. We had a big ramp up in productivity, measured productivity during COVID. It slammed down again in 2022-23. And now it looks like it might be coming back again. Business investment rose and was 8.3% higher through the year. So that's again this capital deepening starting to hopefully catch up. So that's a bit of a more positive story compared to the last financial year. And it does give us hope that there has been this turnaround in productivity after the bubble. Okay, so that's a long story of what's happened over decades, last financial year, during COVID, and over the last 6 months. I'll now say some things about the nature of the longer term challenge in Australia. So if we look at that decade perspective, notwithstanding what's happened during COVID and afterwards, there is still this problem we have that productivity growth has been slowing. The question then is how to think about that and some observations. So the first is that if you just take a very small change in growth rates over a long period of time, that can add up to a lot, just compound growth. So if we went from, say, 1.1% to 1.5% or 1.8% over a 20-year period, that would get you to a very significant increase in living standards over that period. So we're not talking here about necessarily trying to double the productivity growth rate or big numbers in terms of that change. It's small changes that are going to yield long-term results. Obviously, bigger changes are preferred to small, but things can accumulate over time. The other point is that productivity growth, as we saw in the sectoral breakdown just before, it tends to be very unpredictable in terms of where it's going to come from. So we can point to various inventions and innovations after they've happened, but then trying to predict, say, the productivity effect of something like AI or a new way of doing things in healthcare or in education or in any sector in the economy is very difficult. And so there's two ways of thinking about productivity growth. One is like yeast, where something happens in the economy and it tends to lift the productivity growth of all sectors. Or it can be like mushrooms, where it pops up in different parts of the economy. And so this was a terminology that was first used by Arnold Harberger in his presidential address to the American Economic Association a number of years ago. And here's some interesting data then on what that looks like for the US economy. But I think it's a good analogy because productivity growth is very much like that. Ex post, after it's happened, you can always say, oh, well, that was obvious, that could have happened. But trying to predict it in many cases is quite difficult. And it is this process of different sectors grow in their productivity rates at different rates, depending on innovations that happen. Some innovations are economy-wide, other innovations happen in sector by sector. And the third thing that I want to emphasise is these headwinds to productivity growth. So the headwinds in the 5-year productivity review, we looked at two sources of, three actually, sources of headwinds, but categorised into two areas. One is, I think we were just talking about before, the services sector. So the Australian economy is now 80% services by value and 90% by employment. And the thing about productivity gains in the services sector is that we talked about measurement. So often they can be difficult to measure. So how do you measure productivity in education or health or aged care or disability care? So they're difficult to measure, but also they're harder to find. So if you think about, what would a productivity gain look like in, say, a hospital or a GP visit, or in school, you still need a person there working probably the same hours a day to deliver the service. So it's unlikely to look like labour shedding in services. Things like manufacturing, agriculture, it's easier to envisage these things where I come up with a new way of making something, a new way of growing something, and I can replace labour with capital. Labour goes off into some other area, and probably in services, it's easy to envisage what that might look like. It's harder to think about what labour shedding might look like, at a very large scale in services. Often labour is the service. I want to interact with someone, with a person, one-on-one. That's what I value. And so finding those productivity gains is likely to be more difficult. I can't just install a new machine. I mean, I can in a hospital, but it's going to be a quality improvement or a thing of treating a disease better or finding a new treatment. It's not going to be giving the same treatment with half the number of workers. Could be, but unlikely. If we think about AI or robots, then potentially, but that's the thing with services is they're very much face-to-face. And so it would take a big change in people's preferences to say, I'm happy to have a GP consultation with a robot. Whereas, people might be more happy to buy a car that was built by robots with some human intervention. That's just the way people's preferences are. So there's that thing about services, and the services sector has been growing, right? And it continues to grow relative to things like manufacturing, agriculture, and mining. So we think services, it's almost everything in the economy. So education, health, transportation, electricity services, banking, financial services, insurance, all of these things. Basically everything except manufacturing, agriculture, and mining. That's it. Okay, so it's that's what we're talking about. The other headwinds to faster productivity growth are climate change, and not only the impacts of climate change itself that might be happening now, but also the policies that we're using to try to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Right, so potentially they could increase productivity, but not necessarily if they're not done well. And then the other thing that we see as a big headwind is heightened global tensions around trade, particularly in the last few years, a resurgence of protectionist sentiment, a closing, looking inwards of some economies. That's always a big risk to productivity growth, particularly for a small open economy like Australia, because we rely on trade. A lot of our competitive forces comes from exposure to international markets, and also, you know, the incentive to innovate and so on comes from willingness to and a desire to get export income, but also, you know, cross-border investment. And a lot of multi-factor productivity improvements, a lot of innovation comes from getting investment from overseas, whether it's from people who are coming here or investments that are coming in other forms. So to the extent that, you know, those things don't work out well, they could also be a headwind to productivity growth. So we've got slowing productivity growth and these potential headwinds. Services, it just has these unique features. It's not like we would want to say, oh, let's restrict the share of services in the economy. It's, you know, that's not what we would try to do, but it's just acknowledging that's going to be a factor going forward. Non-market services are becoming a larger portion of the services sector in Australia. So that's particularly relevant in things like health and education and the care economy. So if we think about trying to secure productivity improvements in the aggregate, we've got to think about non-market services. And it's not going to be, as I said, necessarily labour shedding. It's got to be about different ways of organising those services, different funding arrangements, quality improvements, those sorts of things, what we're thinking about. And it requires, obviously, a highly skilled workforce. So if we just break that down further, we look at productivity growth in Australia by subsector over time. Goods productivity has been rising rapidly there. And then you can see services of all kinds, sort of distribution or personal business services or industrial services, still increasing broadly over time, but just not as rapidly. So there is this story or idea that we explore in the report. It's due to William Baumol, and he described the situation where you could have rapid improvements in productivity in the goods sector, slower productivity improvements in the services sector. And what happens is, as labour goes out of goods and into services, if they're paid the same wage, then the relative cost of services is going to go up. And so we see that, you know, often as you know, people say, well, things that you know, education, health, they seem to be getting more costly relative to a lot of other things in the economy. That's this story of cost disease that Baumol was really talking about. Now, he said also that it may not necessarily be a bad thing. It's just saying that if productivity improvements are increasing rapidly in the goods sector, then that allows us to afford all these other things that we might want. So although costs are going up, we've now got higher incomes to pay for it. Another chart here, our rank around the world in terms of various sectors. We tend to do very well in agriculture and mining, and even to some extent manufacturing. Not so well on how we rank relative to other economies in terms of labour productivity in services there on the right-hand side. Okay, so finally then, what should we do about this productivity problem? So I've outlined in the aggregate what it looks like, what it means and why we care about it, and the implications potentially if we don't do something about falling growth rates of productivity. So it will mean relatively lower living standards, so just lower than, they'll still increase, but lower than what they would have been. And people will feel that as reduction in their real wages relative to what they would have been, and we get this. It's not a good situation for people over the long term. So we're talking about reductions in real costs of things, improvements in quality, improvements in product variety, and so on. So what should we do about it? Well, we think, given the reforms that have happened in Australia over the last few decades, there's unlikely to be, a policy where you could just say, oh, that's it. We've got it, one thing, let's do that, and that'll increase the growth rate. So there's no silver bullet here. So that means policy should have a broad focus. But if it's going to have a broad focus into a range of areas, that means prioritisation is going to be important. You have to pick and choose what you want to do. So in the Advancing Prosperity report last year, we set out a policy agenda with 71 recommendations across 5 broad areas. The one is around building an adaptable workforce, and that includes everything from improving skills, education, immigration reform, labour market changes, education, anything to do with an adaptable, flexible workforce with the skills that are needed for the future. And given the dominance of services, that's really, that is a key component. They're all important, but the adaptable workforce one is really important. The other one goes to things that affect multi-factor productivity, in particular in the modern economy, data and digital, but also the diffusion of ideas. So we found in our report that actually 98% of Australian businesses don't do innovation that's new to world. So they don't come up with a brand new idea and put it out there. What they do is take an existing new idea and apply it. And that's how productivity improvements diffuse throughout the Australian economy by and large. Not to say that the new to world thing isn't important, but in practical terms, there's a lot of gains there to be made if you could get better diffusion, better adoption of ideas, and so on. And it's 98% of businesses. So we think that's, we put forward a number of policy recommendations around that, but then also around the role of data and digital technology. The third one is creating a more dynamic economy. This is about contestability in markets, making sure that we're open to trade and investment going forward. Lifting productivity in the non-market sector, given its dominance now, and given that's where people seem to really value certain services with demographic changes and so on. So things like education, health, disability care, aged care, and so on. So we think that's worth focusing on that as a specific area. And then securing net zero at least cost to limit any negative productivity impact caused by climate change and adaptation. While there are positive opportunities there, the risks are also very large if we don't get it right, because we get then the impacts of climate change and potentially bad policy. So you want good policy in that area. So that's a broad agenda. I've skipped over a lot of it, 71 recommendations. I won't go through all of them. I encourage you to pick up the report and take a look. But it does then require governments to then think about, well, what should we do first? And that can be thought about in 2 different ways. And so we came up with a prioritisation framework to work out, give some advice to government as to how you would actually go about doing these 71 recommendations. And the first thing to think about is obviously the impact on productivity. So some things there, if you think about, if you could improve Australia's education system, that would have an impact on a lot of people. And if you could do it right, we think it would have a significant impact. Would it be easy to do? Not necessarily. So that's another thing you've got to think about. How complex is it? You have to get the states involved. And then there's the time dimension too. So you may not see an improvement in productivity as a result of changes to education within at least a decade and probably longer. So those are the 2 ways in which we thought about prioritising the reforms we put forward, whether they have a high impact or lower impact on productivity, and then both in the the size and also the time dimension. But then whether they're simple or complex, it's better to do things first, all else being equal. If they're simpler, other things are a lot more complex to do, require legislation, negotiation in the Senate, negotiation with the states. They may be very technical, so that's another thing to think about. And so in the report, what we did was categorise all of these recommendations according to that prioritisation framework. So I think I'll stop there and take some questions.
Thank you, Alex. So, thanks, Alex. We have some time for questions, if you're happy with that.
Yep.
Yes. So maybe we start within this room. Any questions? Comments? Michael.
Hi, Alex. It was a very interesting presentation. It is a bit disappointing to see the productivity move the way it's moving. One of the things that I've noticed over time is my opinion is that there's a lack of real conversation about productivity through wage negotiation or salary negotiation. In the previous decades, many industries and government focused on getting some offset in terms of the real cost of the wage increase with efficiency or productivity trade-off.
Yep.
What's your sense? Because I'm noticing while we're having workers demand real growth increase in wages due to inflation and CPI rise, we don't seem to be having a conversation about productivity and efficiency.
Yeah, so it is something we touched upon in the report. We think that all else being equal, flexible labour market arrangements are better than inflexible ones, but you do have to do it such that it's acceptable for workers and the broader community, and you have to have a safety net in Australia. So it's managing that and working out then what are the best institutional arrangements to do that. And so we looked at the enterprise bargaining framework, and we came up with some suggestions there about, because we did get feedback and evidence that it's not, from right across the board, that was not working that well. So we made some suggestions there, and also in relation to the gig economy. So there's this is a new sort of burgeoning area where people are coming up with innovative ways of providing services that consumers want. But again, we did get feedback that there are concerns in there around safety, minimum standards, these sorts of things for people who work in those industries, and we came up with some recommendations there as well. But since then, the debate has largely moved on, and the government's made some other changes. So we haven't looked at those changes, and we can't really comment on them without having done the work. But it is, I mean, you're right, it has been a feature of of that system over the last decade or so, that it hasn't worked as well as either it used to or people thought it might, in terms of trying to find the productivity improvements that would get you that, or could be traded off for the in other conditions. And a question is whether is that due to the system itself, or is it due to the fact that maybe there just aren't the productivity improvements there? I mean, that could be part of the story as well. But it is a bit of chicken and egg, unless you sort of have a system where that's encouraged and people know that, oh, if I come find a productivity improvement, I'll be able to put it into action. And maybe that has had a bit of a deterring effect there. But that depends on the circumstances. It's hard to say anything about that overall. But it is, I encourage you to go and read the report. We did say something about award simplification, the enterprise bargaining system, and then the gig economy as well. Because, I think it's, as I said, it's an important area because services are just so important now. And going forward, that's, if you think about productivity improvements in health or education, where labour is the service, like those things, whatever you do, there can be changes can be positive or negative. It's going to be really important because it's such a big area of our economy.
So maybe I follow up on this,
Yeah.
if I may. I really liked the slide, I think previous to this,
Yeah.
with the two pillars. One is, or actually this one,
This one? Yeah.
That there are two, let's say, underlying pillars to that. One is the redistribution framework, so how actually efficient are our incentives.
Yeah.
And then the other is the market structures.
Yeah.
In particular, you alluded to education or the healthcare sector. It seems to me that if we think about healthcare, the sector has a fundamental structural rigidity, because you fundamentally have a monopsony in the market, which hampers the ability, especially given that the workforce is able to basically charge whatever price they want for healthcare. So is there, although you're right that the service provision itself may not yield productivity gains, there might be subsumed productivity gains that derive by just in changing that structure. That's your third pillar there.
Yeah.
How is that conversation going? I mean, this
is
really an interesting
I mean, I
thought.
think you know, a good example we talked about in the report was what's the Victorian reform, the funding arrangement.
The DRGs. The DRGs, diagnostic related group.
No. I always forget the name of it. Yeah, the funding arrangement that came in for patient-centered healthcare, but more broadly. Yeah, sorry, activity. Yeah, sorry, activity-based funding.
Yeah.
So, you know, that had been around in Victoria for 20 years before it came on, and I guess the point there is that you can have or identify these productivity improvements somewhere, but unless you have that evidence of what the impact has been diffused across, say in the case of hospitals and health, across the states and everywhere else, and unless you have a willingness to try different things, and that's going to be based on whether you're rewarded for that or not, so that comes back to funding arrangements. You know, the productivity gains could be there somewhere, but that best practice is not becoming common practice. And so that's an issue we identify. And it's education as well, where, you know, the incentive for a particular school to try something new that another school might have done and it works. You know, the incentives there aren't quite right because we don't see that. So we put forward a number of recommendations just on that idea. So there's diffusion I talked about in the private sector, but also in the non-market economy, trying to improve those incentives and just identifying it as an issue that you know, productivity gains probably out there somewhere, but it's the issue of diffusing it and then making that knowledge available to others based on good data. So the data is there too, but we may not be using it effectively as we can, and analysing it and then diffusing it. So I think, you know, it comes down to that, but then also whether funding arrangements are sufficiently flexible or suitable to be able to allow that to happen. In some cases, they may not be. But yeah, it's a bit of a, in that sense, a vague answer. But I think that's, if we're thinking about productivity improvements in the non-market sector, you're exactly right. It's yeah, the way that the markets or the way that the services are sort of organised to be delivered, and that comes down to incentives for innovation and the way in which they're funded.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to shift the conversation here a little bit because including some colleagues at the universities ourselves, we've started investigating this notion of simple rules, which is organizations get highly derivative rules or no rules at all.
Yeah.
And some sort of simple rules are indicated.
This is the sort of Richard Epstein.
Yeah, Epstein-Eisenhower
Yeah.
Stanford colleagues.
Yeah.
Because we know from the 2014 Deloitte report that Productivity Commission did, Australian organizations spend up to upwards of $130 million to comply with self-imposed rules.
Right.
So I was just wondering how much of the organizational productivity, labor productivity here is accounted by the self-imposed organizational rules? And if there are, what measures could we possibly put in place so that we get some of that labor productivity back?
Yeah.
And I know my colleagues are on Zoom at the end of something, and they might have things to add here too.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. So we didn't look at that specifically. We took the view at the outset that although regulation, whether it's formal regulation or the kinds of rules you're talking about, although that's important, we focused on these areas instead. We would have liked to have done more on the things you were talking about. We would have liked to do more on tax as well, but we just had to pick and choose and make it.
Get data on this.
Yeah, and data issue as well. But I mean, we did look at, as examples of the kinds of things we were talking about before. I mean, things like, say in a childcare setting, ratios of employees to children, and sometimes they're fixed rules. Now, there might be good reasons for that, but the point is, as soon as you've locked that in, you've made a decision about the kind of productivity improvement you may be able to get in the future. So it's just worth, potentially revisiting those sorts of things every 5 or 10 years, just to make sure that it's still, if you have had a productivity gain that you can identify and use, then maybe there's a case there to be made. So yeah, but the self-imposed rules thing, I think it's a really interesting question, but we didn't look at it. What we did look at, though, with respect to businesses is the extent to which they know where they are in terms of their practices relative to the frontier. And evidence suggests that they don't. And so that's a problem, because then they don't know how. If you don't know where you are relative to best practice and what to do about it, then you're not going to do it. So we did find that more generally. And then we recommended things like universities publicising what best practice looks like, using data and making that data and analysis available to small businesses, either through market exchange or some other means, because there is that sort of handbrake there where a lot of businesses don't seem to know what best practice looks like, and even what dimension is important and what to focus on. So I think there's a role there for universities and other educational institutions, for consultants, but also industry associations. That should be part of their job to, they've got the big picture, they know what all of their members are doing. If they could make that, that frontier more widely dispersed and disperse that knowledge, then we think that'd be a good thing. But and I guess it would go to things like, do you have these self-imposed rules in your business? Here's what the frontier looks like, so maybe you should think about doing something. So we took a decision not to focus on that too much. I mean, it is part of Australia's regulatory regime that under the regulatory impact statements and so on, that at the federal level and at the state level in certain places, these things are supposed to be looked at when a new regulation comes in. But then there's the existing stock of all the regulations that we have, and we don't tend to revisit and go back and look at what those compliance costs look like relative to what we thought they were. So it's an issue that's very close to my heart, but we didn't look at it in this report.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Really enjoy that. I like this slide, and I'm thinking about the diffusion of technology in Australia's approach, which I agree with your assessment of where Australia's been. We've had this promise that AI will have a great productivity uplift.
Yeah.
What I'm actually a little bit worried about is, does it just create more noise and chaos? So first movers get a productivity uplift, but then everyone else is having to use the AI to deal with the volume that has come. How do you account for that kind of email would be another one. Email originally was a great efficiency, but now I think it's actually a drain on efficiency.
Look, it's a great question. We didn't look at it specifically in this report. We have put out some more other work on AI a couple of weeks ago. From memory, I can't remember whether it looked at that exact question or not. So I might take that one on notice, but we can have a chat about it later on. I guess, yeah, it is a potential risk with, any new technology coming on, and we tend to see that in Australia, in adoption of different kinds of technologies. So whether it's, cloud computing or some things we do very well at, other things like AI, we're not that good at relative to other OECD countries. And so the concern then is, is that a broader problem, or is it just a thing where eventually it will catch up and depends on the structure of our economy? I mean, what we did identify in the harnessing data and digital technology section of the report was that, there is a lot of data that's out there and it's just not being utilised and shared that well, particularly by government. So government has a lot of data, but getting the arrangements right to be able to then share that data, use it in the right way, in a productive way, we think there's improvements to be made there. And then just comes back to this diffusion, getting best practice, common practice in all these areas is a big challenge. And that's not necessarily dependent on a particular technology. It's other things that are, so you could have, diffusion of AI, but as you said, that can go well or go badly. Yeah, but it's not something, that particular issue that you identified. I think it's important, but we didn't touch on it in this report.
Okay, so very quick, 2 questions
Yeah.
from the many that we got online. The fall in 2022-23 productivity, can that be also associated with more lower skilled workers working? That's the question.
Yeah. I think there's something to that. As we had unemployment rates of high 3% last year and still this year. And as you employ more and more workers in the economy, all else being equal, they are going to have you'd expect them to have relatively low skills, otherwise you would have employed them earlier. So there is potentially that's happening. I don't want to make too much of it though, because we haven't done the work to work out exactly what the discrepancy in skills looks like. But that MFP number, the minus 0.5%, it does suggest, we haven't had a decline in innovation. We haven't suddenly forgotten what we knew previously. And so it can, the differential in skills or experience between newer workers and existing workers can often show up as a decline in multi-factor productivity. So we think there's a bit of that going on. So there's definitely but the extent to which that happens and in what sectors, and the extent to which it'll dissipate, because people might get skills and become more experienced very quickly. So there's all those dimensions to it that we don't have the answers to, but I think there's something to that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Benjamin, for that question. Now, to close, what is the #1 action policy that is quick to adopt, that has maximum impact for the non-service industry? This is Kathy.
Okay. I mean, my personal favourite, based on some other work that we've done, it's got I think it'd have a modest impact, but it could be done very quickly, would be to eliminate the remaining tariffs in Australia. So, and the reason for that is twofold. One is they hardly raise any revenue. It's very easy to do. It's just a stroke of a pen. But more broadly, they're not protecting any domestic industries any longer. Most tariffs are now 5 or 10%. And the costs of actually complying with the tariff system as a whole, trying to seek an exemption based on a free trade agreement. We've done some work on the nuisance costs of tariffs, and it's far larger than the revenue they collect. So in terms of productivity improvements, I don't think that would be a level change. It wouldn't be necessarily a growth rate change. I don't think it would be significant. It's not a silver bullet, but I think it's something that could be done relatively easily and quickly. It would have a discernible impact on on businesses. But there are other things like this. It's, you know, people's top 5. We've got 71, so you can pick and choose. And it's not an exact thing. So in the prioritization framework, we said, well, something's likely to have a higher impact, likely to be simpler or complex, but we didn't necessarily put numbers around each of those things where you could then definitely say, oh, this is number 1, this is number 2. You know, it's not that kind of exercise. It's more applying judgment, and governments have got other priorities, and we've got to think about that. But we put forward this framework as a bit of a guide for how you might start to think about implementing policy.
How high is making healthcare more competitive in the priority list?
It'd be, you know, that would have, you know, I think that would be a significant, you get a significant uplift in productivity, assuming you are measuring it correctly, and we talk about that this afternoon. But it's the complexity. Yeah. You know, it's our wonderful federal system, and then you've got private and public healthcare. Then you've got all the incentives related to insurance and workforce issues that are overlaid on that, and everything else that, you know, people here are experts at. So I think the complexity, you know, it's worth doing, but then if you're a government, you have to think about, well, how to actually do this in bite-sized chunks, and you've got to bring people along, just say, we're going to do this, and you know, 15 years down the road, you'll see an improvement. It's a difficult thing to be able to sell.
Fantastic. Please join me once again to thank Alex. Thank you so much for those online and for those who made time to come here in person. We, as I said, we have this recorded, and please follow us on Twitter, now called X, and of course, LinkedIn, and our newsletter for future events. Thank you.